We can begin now. We are late by a few minutes. I won't take much longer, except that it's my pleasant duty, which came to me accidentally. Sometimes accidents come with mixed situation, but it's indeed really my pleasure, Arif, to be here, which compels me to be attentive all through what you are saying. But really, this is an annual feature, Rajni Kothari annual lecture, which is usually given by a chair in democracy at CSDS, which is also named after Professor Rajni Kothari. And this has been a kind of flagship event for us, along with Ganguly lectures that we are holding regularly. But this one has, especially in the sense that it is generally given by distinguished scholars who come and visit us as chair of Kothari in democracy and somebody who has worked in the area of democracy. So I'm very happy to be here and introduce Professor Dirlik. But he has been here for more than 2 months and is known to all of us almost individually. And we had a long sessions with him about his work and dialogues and also critique on both sides, and that was a very memorable event. But we have friends who have come from outside. Professor Arif Dirlik is Knight Professor of Social Science, History and Anthropology, University of Oregon. He is a distinguished visiting fellow of the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, University of British Columbia, and has held honorary appointments at China Center for Comparative Politics and Economics. Central Compilation and Translation Bureau, Beijing. That must be the most powerful, no? Compilation and translation?
It's a section of the, it's a translation bureau.
The Center for the Study of Marxist Social Theory, Nanjing University, and Northwest University in China. He has several very well-known publications. He serves on the editorial boards also of different periodicals in Chinese, Asian and cultural studies, and is the editor of 2 books series, Studies in Global Modernity with the State University of New York Press. His most recent book and publications are Selected Works of Arif Dirlik in Turkish. As you know, he is of Turkish origin, but currently lives in Oregon. So I would not take much time of yours and would invite Professor Dirlik to give his speech, please.
Thank you very much. I will stand if it's all right.
Pleasure.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I was very much honored by being offered the Rajni Kothari Chair at the center this year. And today I'm doubly honored that Professor Kothari has braved the floods of Delhi to attend this lecture. Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to meet you. When I suggested this topic for this lecture, it was on the basis of my sense of general interest in China these days, plus the fact that the paper deals rather broadly with issues of development and democracy, which of course is of great concern or has been of great concern to members of this center. I did not realize before I came to India this time how much the interest in China has grown over the last 2 years since I was last here 2 years ago. So it seems that the paper proved to be, in the end, more relevant than I had anticipated. Since this is a formal lecture With your permission, I'm going to read the paper for this. I will take up in this discussion some questions thrown up by the idea of a Chinese model. As far as I'm aware, the idea of a model originated from foreigners of various stripes, anxious to discover a categorical encapsulation of Chinese development, to be embraced subsequently by Chinese leaders and writers anxious to establish a developmental identity of China's own. The term itself has appeared with increasing frequency over the last decade among both Chinese scholars and foreign observers of the People's Republic of China. Against the continued economic difficulties faced by the US, Europe, and Japan, the seeming success of the PRC in weathering the world recession since 2008 has enhanced the significance of the model, giving it all the trappings of official discourse. There's a suggestion in this official discourse, and among those who serve as its voices, of a model that is not only superior to the reigning neoliberal orthodoxy, promoted most enthusiastically by the United States and United Kingdom, but also, given the remarkably rapid development of the PRC over the last 3 decades, to the developmental path pioneered by Euro-American societies since the origins of capitalist modernization in the 18th century. Yet, what this model consists of and how it may be translated into different social and political contexts remains quite vague. It is not very helpful that as the idea has acquired prominence, it has become the subject of political manipulation by both opponents and proponents of the communist regime in China and abroad, as well as those who benefit from China's development or hope to do so. Yes, double thanks for aging eyes. There are methodological problems as well. The laundry list approach that characterizes most discussions simply draws on a variety of policies pursued by the regime to render what may be contingent responses into a model with its suggestion of conscious design, so that even pragmatism, which resists such categorization, is rendered into the terms of the discourse. At the other extreme are obscurantist references to exceptional Chinese characteristics that by definition rule out the possibility of Chinese development serving as a model of any kind. Only occasionally is there any kind of effort to distill from a wide array of shifting practical policies an account of the structural premises coherent enough to justify the use of the term model. Even then, there is a conspicuous absence of attention to the historical circumstances that may be crucial to understanding the ideological and practical forces that have guided the development of Chinese society. These considerations guide the discussion below. 3 questions are of particular interest in the discussion. First, what significance do we attribute to the idea of a model in the contemporary world, especially with respect to the development of the idea of model within a Chinese political discourse? Second, what might be the features of a so-called Chinese model? And finally, in what sense might this model be appealing to others, especially over the neoliberal model of a market economy, theoretically unfettered by social and political intervention, but also in its own right as a socialist path of development? I will conclude with a brief commentary on the relevance of Chinese Marxism to the official conceptualization of China's development of the model and its implications as a global idea, and the recent transmutation of the Chinese model in the Chongqing model that has revived memories of Maoist Marxism. The idea of a Chinese model may refer to a model of development that's peculiar to China, appropriate to the particular circumstances of Chinese society. Or it may be understood in more universalistic terms as a model open to emulation by others, in which case its relevance transcends the boundaries of Chinese society. The distinction is an important one, even if it is ignored in most references to the Chinese model. If the model is a product of the particular circumstances of Chinese society, the implication is that it may not be emulated by others, or may be emulated only with adjustment to different circumstances and needs. This is indeed the way the Chinese experience as an example for others has been understood in Chinese political discourse going back to the 1940s. Within Marxism and the history of socialist revolutions, the Chinese Revolution was the first, if not the only one, to insist on the necessity of articulating the universalist discourse of theory to concrete local circumstances, as is clearly implied by principles encapsulated in such phrases as making Marxism Chinese, Chinese-style socialism, or most recently, socialism with Chinese characteristics. The strategy of revolution or development expressed by these phrases, alternative Chinese models, distinguish the Chinese path not only from capitalist societies, but also from other socialisms, most importantly that of the Soviet Union while it existed. There has been a sense all along that the experience of the Chinese Revolution was relevant to all societies placed similarly to China in global politics, so-called semi-feudal and semi-colonial societies, which in an earlier day made China a part of both the second and the third worlds. But throughout, the Chinese experience provided not a path to be followed, but as an example of articulating the universal to the particular, or translating the global to the local, which called upon others to find their own paths by following a similar procedure. This idea of a revolutionary practice that necessarily integrated universal principles with concrete local circumstances distinguished the path of revolution not only from one national context to another, but also applied to different localities within the same nation. The vernacularization of Marxism has been one of the significant contributions of the Chinese Revolution to Marxist theory. Despite significant transformations over the years, it has characterized Chinese Marxism throughout, in Maoist as well as in post-Maoist Marxism. This attitude toward the Chinese Revolution has been extended in Chinese Marxism to revolutions and development elsewhere. In light of these considerations, would it make more sense to speak of a Chinese paradigm, Moshe or Fanshe, rather than a Chinese model, Mofan, Moshe? Unfortunately, the distinction disappears in Chinese because the same words usually are used for both paradigm and model, which would shift attention from an example to be emulated to an example that provides not only inspiration, but also procedural principles, central to which is attentiveness to the possibilities and limitations of concrete local circumstances as well as location in the world. This is not only consistent with the legacies of the Chinese Revolution and socialist thinking, but respond more closely to the ideological tendencies of global modernity. It would also avoid the ambiguities of the idea of a Chinese model, with its implications of an established pattern that hardly does justice to what may be but a work in progress, a subject itself of ongoing experimentation. The question I would like to raise here, secondly, is whether the idea of a Chinese model is based on a substantial set of norms and practices, or derives its meaning primarily from its contrast with liberalism or neoliberalism, much as the similar idea of a Beijing consensus acquired a hearing some years back for its supposed contrast to the Washington consensus. If that is indeed the case, secondly, do we need a further specification of its goals, and whether or not those goals pertain simply to issues of economic development or include social and political goals as well? After all, simply being different from neoliberalism does not tell us much about whether or not the model points toward socialism or other, possibly more conservative goals, as another variant of authoritarian developmentalism associated in the late 1980s with so-called new authoritarianism. If it is possible to speak of a Chinese model, it is indeed closest to this latter idea, which bears a close kinship to a socialism that has been stripped of its more radical aspirations to create a just and egalitarian society, free of the exploitative relations characteristic of earlier modes of production, including capitalism. Traceable to the inspiration of Samuel Huntington's 1969 publication, Political Order in Changing Societies, new authoritarianism was associated early on with the developmental paths followed most effectively by a number of Eastern Asian societies, namely Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong under British colonial rule. Following World War II, especially from the 1960s, these regimes achieved rapid development under a combination of political authoritarianism or dictatorship and subcontractual economic development, beginning with the creation of export zones that would serve as the pioneering moments in the emergence of a new international division of labor, neoliberal assaults on national economic boundaries, and ultimately what has come to be known as globalization. In the traditionalism which underwrote their authoritarianism, these regimes also pointed to the cultural resurgences that would come with globalization, challenging the Eurocentric assumptions of an earlier modernization discourse. The result was also the stripping down of modernity to its technologies, which serve different social, political, and cultural trajectories with success dependent on historical circumstances, with cultural legacies allegedly playing a crucial role. It was the developmental success of Eastern Asian societies that empowered the Confucian revival of the 1980s that since then has served as an explanation of their success. The so-called Chinese model may be considered one more variant of authoritarian development that in its origins owed much to these societies, both for inspiration and for direct involvement in triggering its takeoff. Contemporary discussions, not only in the PRC, but also among many foreign commentators, display a remarkable forgetfulness concerning the part that the Japanese, South Korean, Taiwanese, but especially the Singaporean models played in inspiring policy in the initial phase of reform and opening in the 1980s and throughout the 1990s. But their significance goes beyond the inspiration they provided. The flourishing economies of Eastern Asia provided a context for the development of the PRC in which they played a strategically crucial part. It may be no exaggeration to say that investments and technological input from these societies, as well as from overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, were responsible for bringing the Chinese economy to its takeoff stage. This context is also one of the particularities of Chinese development that call into question its emulation by others. There are two important historical differences, nevertheless, that distinguish China's development from that of these neighboring neo-authoritarian regimes that also receive little attention these days, especially among commentators outside of China. The PRC, when it launched its modernization program after 1978, was the product of one of the most important revolutions of the century, heralding the political and economic re-emergence of the colonial, semi-colonial, and semi-feudal worlds through movements for national liberation. In this case, it was a national liberation movement imbued with socialist goals. The liberation of the nation was to be grounded in a social and cultural revolution. It may be noted that other societies of the region also went through social transformations of one kind or another as a condition of development, from the reconstitution of Japanese society after World War II to land reform in Taiwan to anti-colonial movements in Singapore, Korea, and Hong Kong. Unlike in these societies, where the transformations created new social hierarchies consistent with development within the capitalist system, the Chinese Revolution sought a social and cultural transformation toward the creation of a socialist society that stressed egalitarianism, giving a voice to the people, and the creation of a new culture consistent with these goals. The legacy of egalitarianism has been significant, not only in shaping the trajectory of Chinese development, but also in cushioning new inequalities generated by capitalist development, most importantly in the countryside. Another very significant difference was also the goal and the byproduct of the revolution: autonomous and self-reliant development. Transformations in the rest of the societies of the region were accomplished under the aegis of imperial powers, most importantly after World War II, the United States. In the case of the PRC, avoiding foreign domination of the economy, capitalist or socialist, was a fundamental premise and goal of the revolution. Self-reliance, moreover, was equally important for regional as for national development. In the reform period, the importance of the legacies of local self-reliance has been demonstrated most effectively in the part played by local cadres in development projects, also the source, conversely, of corrupt practices that are a major source of popular disaffection and political headache for the central authorities. Self-reliance also made possible the high rate of savings that enabled the state to extract the maximum amount of surplus from the countryside to finance development. What is remarkable about discussions of the Chinese model idea is the obliviousness to this historical trajectory that makes China unique and therefore difficult, if not impossible, to emulate. China, as we know it today, is a byproduct of this revolution, which unfortunately is often beclouded by the claims to continuity with the so-called 5,000 years of tradition of a resurgent traditionalism that covers over the revolution. The fervent nationalism that has drawn much scholarly attention since the 1990s was the product of ideological activity that accompanied the renunciation of revolution in the early 1980s. The revolutionary nationalism of an earlier period that linked the struggle against imperialism with a social revolution at home has been replaced by a de-revolutionized nationalism which places at the fore the patriotic struggles of all Chinese, which has come to encompass all Chinese globally. Combined with assertions of timeless Chinese culture, it lends a strong racial tinge to the understanding of Chineseness. It's a far cry, at any rate, from the more complicated nationalism of an earlier period, driven by a more strictly social and political understanding of the nation. Forgotten in the process is the contribution to the reforms of the experience and organizational legacies of the revolution. More often than not, that same revolution has been rendered into a negative example for its failures, which were real but only part of the story. Deploying the revolution as a foil against which to claim legitimacy for the present has covered over its legacies to the present, both positive and negative. Thus, it is hardly mentioned that during the revolutionary years before 1978, the Chinese economy developed rapidly, registering annual growth rates that match the much-touted rates of the post-1978 period. While occasions of ill-considered enthusiasm had disastrous consequences for the people, and self-reliant development required extraction of excessive amounts of surplus from the people, especially in rural areas, there was nevertheless ongoing improvement in people's lives, from education and health care to increases in life expectancy. The social transformation that the revolution sought may have been less than perfect, but it came with an organizational transformation that unified and integrated the country, laying the infrastructure that would serve well after 1978. These changes also created a new culture of politics and work, the significance of which for later development is yet to be analyzed. On the other hand, while the organizational achievements of the revolution lay the foundation for subsequent development, they also stood in the way of further changes necessitated by development in a new direction. The greatest achievement of the reform period has been the removal of the obstacles while making use of these earlier achievements. Divorced from the legacies of the revolution, the Chinese model becomes one more version of authoritarian development, seeking ideological and cultural compliance with the demands of development as a participant in the global capitalist economy, seemingly without any concerns beyond success in this economy. This is how it is widely perceived in China and by admirers of Chinese development abroad. To cite one recent convert from neoliberalism to the Chinese model, Francis Fukuyama, I quote, "The most important strength of the Chinese political system is its ability to make large, complex decisions quickly and to make them relatively well, at least in economic policy. This is most evident in the area of infrastructure, where China has put into place airports, dams, high-speed rail, water and electricity systems to feed its growing industrial base. Contrast this with democratic India, where every new investment is subject to blockage by trade unions, lobby groups, peasant associations, and courts. Nonetheless, the quality of Chinese government is higher than in Russia, Iran, or the other authoritarian regimes with which it is often lumped, precisely because Chinese rulers feel some degree of accountability toward their population. That accountability is not, of course, procedural. The authority of the Chinese Communist Party is limited neither by a rule of law nor by democratic elections. But while its leaders limit public criticism, they do try to stop on top of popular discontents and shift policy in response. Fukuyama's observations may be exemplary of most discussions of the Chinese model. What makes it work is its deficit of democracy. Authoritarianism makes possible the rapid and efficient mobilization of resources, not possible in a democratic society, exemplified by India and other so-called developing economy. The party state may be repressive in other ways, but it's a force for innovation and efficiency economically. It is also superior to other authoritarian regimes because it is relatively responsive to crisis and the population. In neither case is there any reference to the organizational and cultural legacies of the revolution. whether with regard to repressiveness or responsiveness. There is no hint either that legacies of the revolution, however weakened, may still be powerful ideological forces in shaping both people's demands and leaders' responses. Little noticed also is the continued anxiety about self-reliance and autonomy in the midst of participation in a neoliberal global capitalist economy, of which China has become an integral part. The model appears as just a more efficient authoritarianism of uncertain origin. It's more common than not these days to find the explanation in the pre-revolutionary past, most importantly, Confucianism of both state and people. In the end, what remains of a Chinese model open to emulation by others are authoritarianism, organizational efficiency, and innovativeness, or more accurately, a willingness to experiment with different models of development. What is glossed over are the social goals that theoretically continue to be an important constituent of the model or the paradigm, as I suggest. A good part of the responsibility for this forgetfulness rests with Chinese leaders and theorists who have been anxious to turn their backs on the revolutionary legacies to which they are heirs. The path of development since the launching of the reforms also has produced inequalities that easily create the impression that the revolutionary past is no longer relevant to understanding the present. Chinese corporations are as ruthless as any of their capitalist competitors, if not more so. Earlier promotion of national liberation struggles around the world has been replaced by full participation in power plays for participation in the capitalist world system, and the repressive response to popular dissatisfaction internally smacks more of efforts to sustain the power of the Communist Party than of any moves towards socialist equality and democracy. It is arguable, nevertheless, that unlike many foreign commentators anxious to pinpoint the sources of Chinese success so as to emulate it or partake of its benefits, a keen sense of the past as burden or inspiration continues to distinguish Chinese from foreign notions of a model. Officially, at least, the reforms represent the latest of the series of experiments in the search for national autonomy and national wealth and power that have marked the history of modern China. Among the competing models of a post-Eurocentric global modernity, the Chinese model receives the greatest attention because of the enormous economic achievements of the last 2 decades. It is also the one that's tacitly or explicitly contrasted with the U.S. economy in its resonance with the Beijing consensus idea set against the neoliberal Washington consensus. There is some sense that as the Chinese economy overtakes its rivals, the model too may achieve global hegemony. Despite its haphazard origins, the ascendancy of the China model in global development discourse is not entirely spontaneous. The idea has been the subject of ideological activity openly propagated by official propaganda organs at least since 2009, as the regime has raised its sights as a possible contender for world leadership. The activity has drawn further impetus from the regime's relatively successful weathering of the global recession of 2008-2009, as well as the elevation of the Chinese GDP over that of Japan to the second spot in the world economy. It has benefited enormously in plausibility from the attention brought to China by the 2008 Beijing Olympics and the 2010 Shanghai Expo. The activity is a key element in China's challenge to the U.S. for world leadership. Its timing could not be better as the U.S. economy continues to totter on the brink of another recession. The country suffers materially, morally, and intellectually from the ill-conceived warfare in which it is mired, and the population is increasingly demoralized by a seemingly bleak future, which contrasts with the optimism of the majority of the Chinese population despite serious problems, ongoing repression of dissent, and widening social inequality. The contrast also offers some explanation why the image the regime seeks to project as an alternative to U.S. hegemony falls on receptive ears in many quarters across the globe. Unlike during the Cold War, when the contention over hegemony was fueled by serious ideological difference between capitalism and socialism, however truncated, the struggle over hegemony this time around is for supremacy within global capitalism, the neoliberal capitalism of the Washington Consensus, and the state-managed and regulated capitalism represented by the so-called Beijing Consensus. The juxtaposition is valid, but somewhat misleading. The Chinese economy is state-managed, to be sure, but it also has nourished off globalization. And the Chinese regime since the mid-1990s has been a major proponent of the globalization of markets and production. What characterizes the Chinese economy is a successful combination of authoritarian management internally with effective activity in the neoliberal market. The combination was not of its invention, as it was characteristic of the neo-authoritarian economies to which I have referred above. But the communist regime in China has been particularly successful in managing globalization while at the same time retaining strict control over the national market. A recent discussion by Stefan Palmer observes that, I quote, "Today's emerging markets are increasingly drawn to a new and compelling doctrine of state-managed capitalism. They are learning to combine market economics with traditional autocratic or semi-autocratic politics in a process that signals an intellectual rejection of the Western economic model. According to this doctrine, the government maintains control over a partly liberalized economy, and the people accept a very non-Western kind of civic bargain, political oppression in the public square in return for relative economic freedom and a rising quality of life. Both of these trends have a powerful cheerleader in Beijing." We might add that it's not only in emerging economies that the model is viewed with interest. The rejection of the so-called Western economic model, itself hardly singular, has not stood in the way of Western corporations rushing to ingratiate themselves with the regime in order to gain access to the growing Chinese market. While there are echoes in the current rush to China of earlier myths of a boundless Chinese market, the stakes this time around appear to be real enough to give plausibility to promises of the model. I underline the appear because while the growth of the Chinese economy is indisputable, how much of it may be shared with outsiders remains problematic. Observers have noted the exploitative conditions that limit access to the imagined riches of the Chinese economy, most importantly in the joint enterprises that guarantee technology transfer to China while strictly regulating the shares that accrue to the foreign partners. Some analysts go so far as to suggest that the Chinese economy is only partially globalized, with a protectionist wall jealously guarding the state-owned economy inside the system that's the backbone of the economy and the source of party-state power. Criticism of the Chinese regime for its failures to live up to the demands of neoliberal globalization may be justifiable from a legalistic perspective, but it's widely off the mark in terms of global power politics. How to participate in the global capitalist economy without yielding national sovereignty and autonomy has been an obsessive concern of Chinese radicals since the early 20th century. The Chinese pursuit of national interest in a global economy may not be to the liking of the older centers of hegemony who had expected globalization to further enhance and broaden their hegemony. It makes perfect sense from a Chinese perspective. Unlike Mao-era anti-imperialism that demanded withdrawal from global capitalism, reform-era opening of the national economy has sought to turn the tables on imperialism by exploiting the global economy in the service of national ends. The success with which the Chinese regime has accomplished this goal is a major source of attraction in the global South. Among those who have been subjected to 2 centuries of imperialist abuse and exploitation, and in the eyes of the majority of the Chinese population, the benefits these successful policies have brought outweigh the regime's limitations of citizens' rights, its transgressions against human rights, and even the inequalities it has created in achieving national ends. From these perspectives, authoritarianism seems a small price to pay for achieving long-standing aspirations, especially among those who do not share in the basic assumptions of Euro-American democracy or perceive it with good justification as an instrument of hegemony rather than liberation. In a somewhat different register, there is little sign that evidence of serious problems in Chinese development has done anything to cool off the China fever. It is widely known in China and abroad that the party elite has used its political power to appropriate public wealth and created inequalities that belie its socialist professions. Inequality is a major problem, but it is systemic corruption rather than inequality itself that's the greatest source of dissatisfaction among the public at large and the underlying cause of daily protest against the regime. Party state control of the economy in the name of national autonomy disguises the privatization of state assets which have been carved up by, this is a quotation by the way, which have been carved up by China's rulers, their families and retainers who are all in business for themselves. It would be unfair to compare the contemporary regime with pre-revolutionary militaries, but there is some resemblance in its identification of national autonomy and welfare with its own progressively privatized interests. Where power is concerned, the important difference is in size and organizational reach, which renders it, the party, into a dominant public sphere of its own, with the credibility and power to shape the course of the nation in the interest of its stakeholders much more efficiently than its military predecessors or in more open societies. I'm referring here to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Youth League together have a membership of 160 million people, which is obviously almost more than 1/10 of the population, you can imagine. The confounding of the private and the public does give a new meaning to the old slogan that without the Communist Party, there can be no new China, as many in China are quite aware, even though the news travels mostly by gossip. The plunder of public wealth has been accompanied by investment in a greedy strategy of development, or better still, maldevelopment, that's environmentally and socially destructive. Whether or not this development may be sustainable is quite uncertain and the subject of ongoing speculation in China and abroad. This uncertainty, the corruption, and the repressive apparatus that has been mobilized to keep the lid on popular discontent are surely integral to any notion of a Chinese model. And yet, when they receive honorable mention, more often than not, they are quickly dissolved into enthusiasm over the Chinese miracle, the most impressive and momentous of the miracles that have characterized Eastern Asian development over the last half-century. The teleology derived from these earlier miracles also provides the basis for predictions among foreign promoters that sooner or later the less desirable aspects of the model will fade away as a developing China inevitably moves toward greater democracy and public accountability. future promise is enough to drive away any qualms about present ills. Problems in Chinese development may be easy to overlook when plunder of public resources, corruption, inequality, environmental destruction, and repression have become norms of the global economy. Vague references to a rising middle class also disguise the enormous class differences within the middle class. But there, too, the emergence of a wealthy ruling elite does not seem particularly out of the ordinary against the background of a transnational concentration of wealth and power in ever fewer hands. Still, there is something remarkable about quote, Western, unquote, corporations' ready and seemingly enthusiastic compliance with the authoritarian dictates of a state-managed economy, of which systemic corruption is an integral ingredient. It is no surprise that inherently amoral, elitist purveyors of luxury goods and services, from manufacturers of high-end cars and yachts to exclusive makers of jewelry and perfume, should seek to get in on the Chinese market and add the aura of their glamour to the newly wealthy elite. But so do the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan, not to speak of countless corporations, large and small, for which China has become the new economic frontier that in turn bestows prestige on those allowed to share in its riches. Monetary gain and fear of being excluded from a growing market are no doubt very important factors in such compliance. Self-serving though it is, the argument that involvement in the Chinese economy will in the long run help iron out problems of Chinese development is not to be dismissed offhand. But the complicity also suggests ideological resonance between the authoritarian neoliberalism of the Chinese regime and the anti-democratic authoritarian premises of corporate organization that goes hand in hand with their global neoliberalism. The rush to China has brought out into the open the incipient authoritarianism of global corporations, as well as of the educational institutions entrusted with the intellectual, cultural, and social preservation and propagation of democracy and the public good. Business corporations are not alone in giving ideological cover to the authoritarian practices of the Chinese regime. More effective in prestige because of their claims to intellectual and ethical purity may be the cover afforded by educational institutions, which are increasingly allied with business interests and behave like businesses themselves. North American, European, and Australian higher education institutions are as eager as any business to establish joint enterprises in China. On the home front, they welcome with a mixture of cultural and economic anticipation the so-called Confucius Institutes, grassroots propaganda organs of the Chinese state with seeming obliviousness to the oppressive activities of the same propaganda establishment in the PRC in suppressing intellectual and political dissent, which is carried to campuses abroad in efforts to discourage or even suppress discussion of issues the PRC deems controversial. Faculty and students who readily protest government involvement on university campuses in the U.S. appear, I mean here the U.S. government involvement, in the U.S. appear to be mostly silent when it comes to these institutions that arrive with promises of language, culture, and business ties. Contrary to those who are convinced that economic development and new middle-class values must inevitably usher democracy in their wake, there is no reason to think on the basis of available evidence that authoritarianism is inconsistent with a neoliberal global economy. Indeed, it may be quite the reverse. What is at risk is not authoritarianism, but democracy and the public good as economic imperatives gain ascendancy in global competition for resources and economic and political supremacy. to listen to U.S. political leaders, including President Obama, who surely knows much better. The goal of democracy is most importantly, let me read it again. To listen to U.S. political leaders, including President Obama, who surely knows much better, the goal of democracy is most importantly to foster technological innovation. President Hu Jintao would have no problems agreeing with that. Neither would Li Changchun, the electrical engineer in charge of the propaganda apparatus, as a member of the Politburo. Despite brave talk about democracy, authoritarianism is more necessary than ever to keep in check popular frustration with the inequalities that globalization has produced, not just in China, but globally. If Chinese development has given it a new respectability, it is by no means an exclusive Chinese characteristic. What Stefan Halper describes as the China effect may be real enough, but it is misleading to focus one-sidedly on Chinese policies and ignore the part global corporations and educational institutions play in sustaining authoritarianism, even as they nourish off and deepen inequalities in the emergent reconfiguration of the world system. Given the strategically crucial role the People's Republic of China has come to play in the global economy, the idea of a Chinese model, as it is framed in most discussions, articulates fundamental contradictions of global capitalism. The self-serving claim cited above that the Chinese model is superior not only to contemporary alternatives, but even to the economies that initiated global economic modernization, is to be approached critically because of its obliviousness to historical circumstances, as well as to problems that await solution that are the products of development. Judging by railroads and automobiles, China is a society on the move, which contrasts sharply with stagnation elsewhere. But the problems are equally impressive. Unprecedented social and spatial inequalities resulting from development over the last 3 decades, reversing the achievements of the revolution. Enormous ecological problems that threaten further development. Corruption, social instability arising from these problems, and the deficit of democracy, however conceived, along with issues of free speech and legal due process. These, too, are products of the so-called China model. A recent discussion refers to China as the world's first rich-poor country, with a GDP that's ranked number 2 in the world and a per capita GDP that ranks at number 127. The gap between the two rankings may serve as a measure of severe social and regional inequality that's easily overlooked in the rush to partake of, quote, the deep wallet, unquote, of a dictatorial regime, and a new adoration for the unscrupulous Chinese elite as consumers of luxury goods. With severe inequality as a global condition, what attracts the greatest attention is the seemingly superior performance of the Chinese national economy. How this performance may be sustained, nevertheless, presents serious questions. Above all, however, is the question of the direction of development, which is another crucial aspect of the notion of an alternative. China's developmental success has been achieved within the parameters set by existing models of development, most notably in the U.S., with a heavy emphasis on urbanization, the provision of consumer goods internally and externally, and the corresponding concentration of resources. While it is widely recognized that such a model of development may not be any more sustainable in China than in the United States, so far the corrections to it seem to have been mostly of a cosmetic nature. The destruction of the countryside and the depletion of natural resources continue apace. So the reliance on real estate speculation and automobile manufacturing to keep the engine of growth in motion. These are problems readily acknowledged by the leadership, and yet there is no plausible alternative in sight. It seems premature to speak of a Chinese model until these problems have been resolved, let alone a model as a socialist society. It also seems that those abroad who are most taken with the Chinese model are those who place economic and technological development ahead of all other social and political concerns. Admirers of authoritarianism seeking escape from the problems of democratic societies, or simply groupies of China cultivated by Confucius institutes who seem to perceive China as a melange of an exotic but suddenly accessible culture and much-needed commercial opportunities for the future. The success of the PRC in alleviating poverty is a powerful source of attraction. So is the seeming vitality of Chinese society, which disguises that it suffers from the same problems that afflict liberal corporate economies, especially problems of deep inequality, cultural disorientation, and ecological destruction. China's problems are not exceptional. Currently available models all suffer from more or less similar problems which diminish their claims to serve as models for others. This is part of the crisis of our times. I think it's fair to say in the case of China that however satisfying it may be from a nationalistic perspective, little of the admiration for China is fostered by hopes in movement toward socialist goals of social justice, equality, and democratic practices based on those ideals. The Chinese model, in its success or its competitor, can even be put to use in some advanced societies, such as the US, as an excuse for curtailing democracy and redirecting education toward corporate goals. There's also a perception, that of a minority, unfortunately, that if it is indeed possible to speak of a Chinese model, it is as a model in the process of formation, a work in progress with a still uncertain future. It is quite obvious that even the leadership in China is deeply divided over solutions to these problems, which are crucial to the formulation of development strategies. As is evidenced once again from the most recent National People's Congress in 2011 and the new 5-year plan, resolving the social challenges of development remains a priority. Whether or not these concerns in the long run overcome the fetishism of development and redirect it toward socialist ends remains an open question. Even if socialist policies are rejuvenated, moreover, questions will persist concerning their implementation over obstacles presented by conflicting economic and political interests. It's also important to remember that as times have changed, so has the understanding of socialism as necessarily people-based rather than state-centered. The Chinese Revolution of the 20th century played an important part in placing some of these questions on the political agenda of Marxism and socialism. Whether or not they remain on the development agenda will have important consequences for the future. Intensifying tension over the past year between the Communist Party and society at large, and within the Communist Party itself, offers cogent evidence of the pitfalls of facile judgments about the Chinese model. While foreign commentators have been waxing enthusiastic about the China model, it's quite evident that Chinese leaders and public are in search of a model that will help overcome a brewing crisis of governance, which no doubt has been exacerbated by anxiety about the sustainability of the existing path of development and inflationary pressures that have resisted the government efforts to overcome them. The Chongqing model, which received much attention for its radical song and dance revivalism, during celebrations of the 90th anniversary of the founding of the party earlier this year, just recently has been challenged by a Guangdong model, which places greater emphasis on democratization and closer attention to public grievances, such as those of labor. In the meantime, netizens have found a model in India in the figure of Anna Hazare to answer to their calls for a public voice in politics and struggle against deep-seated corruption. An ongoing discussion within the party over the future of politics spilled out into the public just recently in a discussion of major party intellectuals sanctioned by the party itself, commemorating Deng Xiaoping's seminal 1981 essay, How to Resolve Certain Questions in the History of Our Party. As the participants suggest, the various models that are under discussion represent alternative responses to a crisis of governance, motivated by different interests and ideological orientations. The important party intellectual Zhang Musheng, supported by other powerful figures, advocates a return to the policies of new democracy, which guided Chinese political, social, and economic policy between 1940 and 1956. To many, the golden age of socialism before the turn to the radical policies of the Cultural Revolution, which in its origins, eruption, and consequences covers the 2 decades from 1956 to 1976. I would like to suggest to the contrary, that the present crisis is once again the crisis of new democracy, this time around within the context of a global capitalism of which China is an integral part. New democracy was characterized by a mixed economy and politics under the direction of the Communist Party. When Deng Xiaoping considered in 1981 that the contradictions facing China were the same contradictions that had prevailed in 1956, he was tacitly announcing a return to new democracy. And over the 3 decades since, it is such a mixture that has guided Chinese development. New democracy, however, presented an unstable mixture of capitalism and socialism. The contradictions created by the mixture were resolved after 1956 by a turn to radical socialism. Similar contradictions have repeatedly disturbed Chinese economy and society since the beginning of reform and opening. The first decade of hastened reform and opening culminated in the crisis of 1989, in which inflation, unemployment, especially of youth, and corruption were also primary issues. The response to the crisis this time around was to turn to opening to global capitalism in a headlong rush. We might note that this turn coincided with the fall of socialism in Eastern Europe and Russia and the vitality of Eastern Asian economies, which reinforced arguments for further opening. Now, after another decade and a half, when the turn has succeeded beyond all expectations and China has become a backbone of the global capitalist economy, the many contradictions in Chinese society find expression in what we may describe, following Maoist language, as the primary contradiction that gives meaning to all the others, the contradiction between the party and society, a contradiction in governance. The Chongqing model, with its Maoist revivalism, and the Guangdong model, standing for further liberalization, are but two products of the mixture that has characterized Chinese politics and society. They once again present a choice, if I may simplify a bit, between greater emphasis on the socialist aspect versus a complete turn to capitalism. Nevertheless, the Chongqing model, no less than the Guangdong one, presupposes continued integration with the global capitalist economy. The two models are both equally developmentalist in their assumptions, with unquestioned faith in technological fixes. and neither promises much by way of resolving fundamental questions of environment, urban-rural relations, deep inequalities in society, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, at least some among the people feel the need for something else, confrontation of the fundamental corruption of the system, which may be resolved only through greater voice for the people. If we are to speak of a Chinese model, which is encouraged by the economic horse race that has taken hold of contemporary thinking on development, we need to be cognizant that in the perceptions and desires of Chinese themselves, there is more than one model, each with its own social and political implications. To ignore this with a single-minded focus on GDPs, GNPs, or consumption figures is also to gloss over the complexities that Chinese themselves face in resolving the consequences of development. Instead of searching for models for emulation, we might do well to ponder these consequences. China has problems of its own, but like everything else these days, the problems are not just theirs alone. Thank you very much.